My name is Julianne Howe-Bowens, and I will be your host and narrator today. Now, at this time, if you have not already done so, please take out your cell phones and turn them to silent. Thank you guys so much. So, today you will be hearing the same version of A Christmas Carol that Dickens himself when he took to the stage. During the performance, we will be stepping outside of the script to give some context and some background, and then we'll get right back into the story. It's about past, the present, and the future. It's about hope, fear, and memory. And it's about spirit, all kinds of spirit. The kind that you raise your glass to for a toast. The kind that rattle their chains and enter your room without bothering to open the door. And the kind that penetrate the stoniest of human hearts. They're all here. And we're so glad that you are here to share the story with us. Now please enjoy A Christmas Carol.
Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, his sole mourner.
Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name, however. There it stood for years afterwards above the door, Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, sometimes Marley. He answered to both names, it was all the same to him.
Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, was Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. External heat and cold had little influence on him. No warmth could warm, no cold could chill him.
No one ever stopped Scrooge on the street to say, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When are you coming to see me?" No beggars ever implored him to bestow a trifle. No children ever asked him what was o'clock. Even the blind men's dogs seemed to know him, and when they saw him coming on, they would tug their owners into doorways and up courts. But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. To edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy. Keep your distance.
Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. The weather was cold and bleak outside. The city clocks had only just struck 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open that he might keep his eye upon his clerk. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach.
A humbug!
He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle, you don't mean that, I'm sure."
I do. Merry Christmas. What right have you got to be merry? What reason have you got to be merry? Oh, poor enough.
Come then, what reason have you to be dismal? What right have you to be morose? You're rich enough. Look, don't be angry, Uncle. Come dine with us tomorrow.
I'll see you in. Yes, indeed, he went the whole length of the expression. He said he would see him in that extremity first.
But why? Why?
Why did you get married?
Because I fell in love.
Because you fell in love. Good afternoon.
His nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season to the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially.
There's another fella, my clerk. 15 shillings a week and a wife and family talking about Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam.
This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands, and bowed to him. Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?
Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night.
We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner.
At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head.
At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we make some provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir.
Are there no prisons?
Plenty of prisons.
And the union houses and the workhouses, are they still in operation?
They are. I wish I could say they were not.
And the treadmill and the poor law, are they still in full vigor?
Oh, very busy, sir.
I was afraid of what you said at first. Something had occurred to keep them from their useful course. I'm very glad to hear it.
Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christmas cheer of mind or body to the multitude, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall we put you down for?
Nothing.
You wish to remain anonymous?
I wish to be left alone. Since you asked me what I wish, that is my answer, gentlemen. I don't make merry myself at Christmas. I can't afford to make idle people merry. I support the prisons and the workhouses. That costs enough. Those who are badly off must go there.
But many people cannot do that, and many would rather die.
If they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. Good day.
Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself and a more facetious temper than was usual with him. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge, dismounting from his stool, tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed out his candle and put on his hat.
You want the whole day tomorrow, I suppose?
If quite convenient, sir.
It is not convenient. It is not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself mightily ill-used, I'll be bound.
Yes, sir.
Yet you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work.
It's only once a year.
Yeah, that's a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket the 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning.
Dickens himself called A Christmas Carol the Sledgehammer. When he wrote it, he was 31 years old, and and already a famous novelist, but he was angry. What made him angry was the poverty he saw all around him in the cities such as London and in Manchester. He was angry at the pathetic resources at the ragged schools, the charitable schools at which the children were offered the barest semblance of an education. He was angry about child labor. Children, often less than 10 years old, were sent to do hard manual labor in factories and in coal lines. He was angry at Victorian England's refusal to take notice. Most of all, he was angry at people like Ebenezer Scrooge, people who ignored the poverty all around him. Dickens' friends urged him to write a political pamphlet on poverty, but Dickens had a better idea. He would create a sledgehammer that would come down with 20 times the force of a political pamphlet. The sledgehammer Dickens created was A Christmas Carol, and that's what it is still to this day. Back now to Christmas Eve, the 7th anniversary of the death of Scrooge's partner, Jacob Marley. Scrooge is going home and about to begin the longest night of his life.
Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, he went off to bed. He lived in chambers that had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in the lowering pile of a building up a yard. The building was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms all being let out as offices. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door of this house, except that it was very large. Also, that Scrooge had seen it every night and morning during his whole residence in this place. Also, that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, and yet Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face.
Marley's face. It was not angry or ferocious the way Marley used to look, with its ghostly spectacles up on its ghostly forehead. And Scrooge looked on at this phenomenon. It turned into a knocker again. Scrooge said, "Pooh," and closed the door with a bang.
The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room in the house and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echo its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened of echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the steps. Slowly, too, trimming his candle as he went. Up went Scrooge, not caring a button for its being very dark. Darkness is cheap. Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy doors, he took care to walk through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Quite satisfied, he closed the door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the very low fire to take his gruel. As he threw back his head in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room. It was with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. Soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This was succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain across the casks in the wine-merchant's cellar. Then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs. Then coming straight towards his door, it passed through the heavy door, and a specter passed into the room before his very eyes.
The same face. The very same face. Marley. With his pigtail and his usual waistcoat and boots. The chain he drew was clasped around his middle. It was long and it wrapped around him like a tail. The chain was made of padlocks and keys and deeds and ledgers. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge could see the two buttons on his waistcoat behind. Scrooge had always heard Marley had no bowels, but he never believed it until now.
No, nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and noticed the very texture of the forward kerchief about its head and chin, he was still incredulous.
How now? What do you want with me?
Much!
Marley's voice, no doubt about it. Who are you?
Ask me who I was.
Who were you then?
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
Can you sit down?
I can.
Well, do it. Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know if a ghost so transparent could find himself in the condition to take a chair. But he did take a chair opposite the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it.
You don't believe in me.
I don't.
What evidence would you have of my reality beyond your senses?
I don't know.
Why do you doubt your senses?
Because this sort of thing affects them. A disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You could be an undigested piece of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than grave about you, whatever you are.
Scrooge was not so much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is, he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his horror. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, when taking off the kerchief about his head and chin, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast.
Oh, I say, dreadful apparition. What do you want with me? Why do you trouble me?
Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not?
I do. I must. But why do the spirits walk the earth? And why do they come for me?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow man and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness.
You are fettered. Tell me why.
I wear the chain that I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it by my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is it parting strange to you? Or would you know the width and length of the coil you bear yourself? It was as heavy and as long as this. 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, and a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer.
You always were a friend to me. Thank you.
You will be haunted by 3 spirits.
Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? I think I'd rather not.
Without these visits, you cannot hope to shun the path that I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1.
Couldn't I have them all at once and get it over, Jacob?
Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us. When it said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude with its chain wound over and above its arm. The apparition walked backwards from him, and with every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when he reached it, it was wide open. The spectre beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer.
Scrooge stopped, not so much in obedience, but in surprise and fear. For at the raising of the hand, he seemed sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory.
The spectre, after listening for a while, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night.
Dickens was something of a connoisseur of ghosts and the supernatural. He used to attend seances and table rapping sessions, but he may have been a bit controversial in assigning Marley's ghost to chains. As one expert wrote, the dragging of chains is not the fashion of English ghosts. Dead or alive, English spirits are free. Dickens knew a great deal about magic. He was an expert conjurer, always in demand to perform at children's parties. If you could see me, he wrote a friend, burning pocket handkerchiefs without hurting them, you'd never forget it as long as you live. So now we meet the first of the 3 spirits to come to haunt Ebenezer Scrooge, the ghost of Christmas past. This is how Dickens described him. He's old, it seems, but from the childlike face, there's a light coming from the top of its head, and it fluctuates. So sometimes Scrooge can see the head, but not the body. Sometimes the body, but not the head. Very ghostly. This is the spirit who takes Scrooge back through the years to his lonely childhood and reminds him of some people who work for him. People who held out a hand of friendship to an awkward, solitary boy when he needed it most. Like his old apprentice master, Mr. Fezziwig. The spirit arrives just as Marley's ghost said it would, on the stroke of 1.
Are you the spirit whose coming was foretold to me?
I am.
Who and what are you?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
No, your past. things that you'll see with me are shadows of the things that have been. They would have no consciousness of us. Rise and walk with me.
It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the hour or the weather were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, so he rose. But seeing how the ghost made toward the window, he clasped his robe in supplication. I am mortal and am likely to fall.
Bear but a touch of my hand there, and you shall be upheld, and in more than this. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood in the busy thoroughfares of a city. It was plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here, too, it was Christmas time. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge, "Do you know this place?"
Know it? I was apprenticed here.
They went in at the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had 2 inches taller, he would have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried out in great amazement,
Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's old Fezziwig alive again!
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick!" A living and moving picture of Scrooge's former self as a young man came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice.
Dick Wilkins, to be sure! Bless me, there he is! Oh, he was very much attached to me. Poor dear, dear.
"Yo-ho, my boys, no more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Before a man can say Jack Robinson, let's clear it all away, lads, and let's have lots of room here."
Clear it away. There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Anything that was movable was packed up, the floors were swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, the fuel was heaped on the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and dry and bright a ballroom as you could ever desire on a winter's night.
In came a fiddler with a music book and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it, tuning like 50 stomach aches.
In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 followers whose hearts they broke. In came all of the young men and women employed in the business.
In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow.
And away they went, top couples at once, 20 couples, down the middle and up again. Old top couples always turning up at the wrong place, new top couples starting off as soon as they got there. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig clapped his hands to stop the dance and cried out,
"Well done!"
and the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter especially provided for that purpose. There were more dances, and there were more forfeits, and there were more dances, and there was cake, and there was a great cold roast, and another great cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer.
But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind you, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told it to him, struck up Sir Roger de Coverley.
Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work between them. And 20 pairs of partners, people who would not be trifled with, people who would rather dance and had no notion of walking.
But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig.
When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. And Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on each side of the door, and shaking hands with each individual as he or she went out, wished him or her a very Merry Christmas.
When everybody had retired but the two apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop.
During the whole of this time, Scrooge acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, along with his former self. He corroborated everything, he remembered everything, he enjoyed everything, and he underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and of Dick were turned away, that he became conscious of the ghost, and remembered that the ghost was looking full upon him, with his light burning clear and bright. The ghost spoke to him.
A small matter to make these silly folk so full of gratitude.
Small?
Why is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?
It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, things so slight and insignificant that cannot be counted or added up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it costs a fortune.
So, what's the matter?
Nothing in particular?
Oh, something, I think.
No. I should like to be able to say a few words to my clerk just now. That's all.
This is where Charles Dickens lived a part of his own childhood. Dreadful, lonely, desperate years, which he never forgot. Number 16 Bayham Street in Camden Town. Dickens' father, John, was a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, a comfortable enough position, but he lost the job. When the family arrived in Bayham Street, quite gentrified today, young Charles had to be taken out of school on his 12th birthday. He was sent to work in a shoe polish factory on the north bank of the River Thames. Each day, he walked 3 miles from Camden Town to Warren's blacking factory. He worked a 10-hour day and then walked 3 miles home through the dark and dangerous streets. In later life, Dickens could never remember how long he spent in that rat-infested hellhole. It may have been as little as a year, but he never forgot it, and he never forgave. There was something even worse. His father was imprisoned for debt in this grim place, the Marshalsea of the south bank of the River Thames. And it was 12-year-old Charles who visited him and ran his errands, pawning family possessions, trying to get his father released, pleading with friends and relatives to help. Dickens made bitter but effective use of those dreadful experiences in his novels. Fagin's Loft and Oliver Twist are based on the blacking factory. Mr. Micawber is imprisoned in the Marshalsea in David Copperfield. And here in A Christmas Carol, he makes use of a house on Bayham Street. It becomes the home of Scrooge's downtrodden clerk, Bob Cratchit. So, after the ghost of Christmas past, Scrooge is visited by the second of the 3 spirits, the ghost of Christmas present. And this isn't a frightening ghost at all. A jolly giant, Dickens describes him, an enormous, overgrown schoolboy who takes Scrooge through the streets of London and Camden Town. There, he will witness the Cratchit's Christmas dinner. Bob Cratchit and his wife have 6 children. The youngest of them, Tiny Tim, has his legs in irons and is supported on crutches. The Cratchits can't afford a turkey for Christmas dinner, but they do have a goose.
Oh, there never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient feast for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone left upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows.
But now, the plates being changed by Miss Melinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room too nervous to bear witness, to take up the pudding and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning it out. Suppose someone should have gotten over the wall in the backyard and stolen it. All kinds of horrors were supposed. Hello, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house next door to a pastry cook. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, hard and firm, blazing in a half a quadrant of United brandy with a Christmas holly stuck in the top.
Oh, a wonderful pudding, Bob said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now that the weight was off her mind, she would confess she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought that it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been a heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared and the hearth swept and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These, however, held the hot stuff from the jug as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed a toast. "A Merry Christmas, my dears. God bless us." Which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him.
Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live.
"I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die."
No. Oh, no, kind spirit. Say that he will be spared.
"If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find the child here. But what then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population."
Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words being quoted by the spirit. and he was overcome with penitence and grief.
Man, if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven, you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust.
Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke and trembling cast his eyes on the ground, but then he raised them quickly on hearing his own name. Another toast by Bob Cratchit.
Mr. Scrooge, I give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast.
The founder of the feast, indeed! I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it.
Oh, my dear, the children, Christmas Day.
Oh, it should be Christmas on which one toasts the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow.
My dear, Christmas Day.
I'll drink to his health for your sake and the day's, not for his. Long life to him! A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year! He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt.
The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings, which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care a tuppence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mere mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the family, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes.
That goose the Cratchits had for dinner probably cost a whole week's wage. So how did Bob afford it? Well, the Cratchits belonged to the Goose Club, as many poor families did. Each week they'd subscribe a few pennies to the club so that on Christmas Day they could go and claim their goose. Christmas Day in Dickens' time was a family day, but above all, a day for eating. But it wasn't an automatic holiday. Bob Cratchit had to ask Mr. Scrooge for the day off. It was certainly a time for parties like the Fezziwig Ball. There were dances and children's games such as Blind Man's Bluff and decorations. England was just beginning to import some customs from Holland and Germany. St. Nicholas was becoming familiar as Santa Claus, and the Christmas tree was just becoming a feature of seasonal decorations. Carol singing was, of course, years old, but something new was happening. The year A Christmas Carol appeared, so did the first commercially produced Christmas card. And this is it. All his life, Dickens had a passion for Christmas, a passion that began perhaps with the first 8 Christmases of his childhood. Every one of them a white Christmas with snow upon the ground, an extraordinary sequence for the usually damp and mild English climate. So now we come to the last of the 3 spirits to visit Scrooge, but it's the most dreadful. The ghost of Christmas yet to come seems to scatter gloom and mystery, Dickens writes. It's shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its face, its head, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. And this is the ghost who takes Scrooge on his most frightening journey, a journey of some events which will surely come to pass if Scrooge does not reform his ways. They pass a corpse lying on a bed. Is it the dead body of Scrooge himself? Surely not, pleaded Scrooge. They return to the Cratchit's house in Camden Town, where Tiny Tim has died. His body lies upstairs. He will be buried on Sunday.
Very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner and sat looking up at Peter, the eldest, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them.
Where had Scrooge heard those words before? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. But why had he not gone on?
Bob came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. The two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, Father. Don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said.
Sunday? You went to the cemetery today then, Robert?
Yes, my dear. I wish you could have gone. It would do you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child. Bob broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart, perhaps, than they were. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went back downstairs again quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely met but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day and seeing that he looked just a little down, you know, inquired what had happened to distress him. On which, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you ever heard, I told him, "Oh, I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, and heartily sorry for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way, that is where I live. Pray, do come to me." Now, it wasn't for the sake of anything that he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way, that this was really quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us.
I'm sure he's a good soul.
You would be sure of it, my dear, if you saw and spoke with him. I shouldn't be at all surprised, now mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation.
Only hear that, Peter!
And then, said one of the girls, Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself. Oh, get along with you, retorted Peter, grinning. Oh, it's just as likely as not, said Bob. One of these days, although there's plenty of time for that, my dears. But however and whenever we part from one another, I'm sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim or this first parting that there was among us. And when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was but a little child. We shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor tiny Tim in doing it.
Spectre, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it. I know not how. Tell me what man that was whom we saw lying dead.
Instead, the ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him to a dismal, wretched, ruinous churchyard. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one.
Before I draw nearer to that stone at which you point, answer me one question. Are these the things that will be, or the shadows of things that may be only?
Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood.
Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends. But if those courses are departing from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me.
The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name.
Ebenezer Scrooge.
The ghost's finger pointed from the grave to him and back again.
No. Spirit, no!
The ghost's finger still was there.
Spirit, hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been. Why show me this if I am past all hope? Assure me that I may yet change these shadows with an altered life. I want Christmas in my heart, and I will try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past and the present and the future, and the spirits of all three shall strive within me. And I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me that I may sponge away the writing on this stone.
Clasping his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, Scrooge saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Yes, and the bedpost was his own, and the bed was his own, and the room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in.
I don't know what to do. I'm as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I don't know what day it is. I don't know how long I was among the spirits. I don't know anything. I am quite a baby. I don't care. I'd rather be a baby.
Scrooge was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head.
What's today? Scrooge calling down to a boy in his Sunday clothes.
Hey?
What's today, my fine fellow?
Today, it's Christmas Day.
Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. Well, of course they can do anything they want. Of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow! Do you know the poulterers on the street on the next corner?
Oh, I should hope I do.
An intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey, the one hanging in the window, not the small one, but the big one?
What, the one as big as me?
Intelligent boy, he's a pleasure to talk to. Yes, my boy, that's the one.
Well, why it's hanging there now?
Is it? Go buy it.
What?
No, I'm in earnest. Go buy it. Bring it back here and I'll give you a shilling. Come back here within 5 minutes, I'll give you half a crown.
The boy was off like a shot.
I'll give it to Bob Cratchit. He shan't know who sent it.
The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did somehow. And he went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulter's man. It was a turkey. He never could have stood upon his 2 legs, that bird. He would have snapped them off short in a minute. Scrooge dressed himself all in his best and at last got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present. And walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-natured fellows said, "Good morning, sir, a Merry Christmas to you."
And Scrooge said afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he'd ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears.
In the afternoon, he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. "Why, bless my soul, who is that?"
"'Tis I, your Uncle Scrooge. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in, friend?"
Let him in. It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. Scrooge was at home in 5 minutes, and nothing could be heartier. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness.
But Scrooge was at the office the next morning. As long as he could be there before Bob Cratchit was and watch him coming in late, that was the thing he set his heart upon. And he did it. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob. He was exactly 18 and a half minutes behind his time. "Hello," growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, or as close as he could feign it. "What do you mean, coming here at this hour of the day?"
I am very sorry, sir. I am behind my time.
"You are? Yes, I think you are. Right this way, sir, if you please."
It's only once a year, sir. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir.
"I'll tell you what. I'm not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, I'm about to raise your salary."
Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him, and calling to the people in the court for help and a straitjacket.
"Merry Christmas, Bob. A merrier Christmas than I've given you in many a year, my good fellow. I will raise your salary, and I will endeavor to assist your struggling family, and we'll discuss this over a Christmas bowl of smoking biscuit, Bob. Make up the fires, go buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit."
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he became a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but his own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him.
Scrooge had no further intercourse with spirits, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. And may it be truly said of us, and of all of us.
And so, as Tiny Tim observed,
God bless us, everyone.
They had book